I flatlined. I died in the dentist's chair 9 years ago. I saw my body, I left it, and this beautiful beam of light came to my encounter.
I looked at my mom and I felt how scared and panicky she was, and I looked at my dad and I could see them carrying my limp body out of the water, and they were working on it.
This young man saw a relative who he believed was alive, but he saw this relative during his near-death experience on the other side, only to find out later that the relative had died and he didn't know it.
The near-death phenomenon alone challenges humankind to redefine life as well as death.
The near-death experience is an experience that people have. It's usually associated with a cardiac arrest, but not necessarily so. Sometimes people will have experiences similar to NDEs when they think they're about to be killed, or for example, if they're falling from a great height. So you can't just tie them in with a particular physiological event. They can occur under a number of different circumstances, but classically cardiac arrest is the type of event which causes them the most, and they seem to occur in about 12% of cardiac arrests, possibly somewhat more than that. Figures vary, but that's a good estimate.
To go any further than that, to say, well, person goes through a tunnel or sees a bright light, we run into little problems with that. But for the near-death experience itself, the phenomenon itself, it happens somehow during the venue of actual death. It is an otherworldly experience that convinces the individual or shows the individual or enables the individual to experience life on the other side of death.
If we're looking at how did this develop and what's happening over the last 3 or 4 decades, you actually can go back to the beginning of time. In the early religious literature, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it talks about these phenomena.
Where did we get our morals? Where did we get understanding of the human race? Did it indeed come from near-death experiencers? It could have. In his book, The Republic, Plato recorded the story of the soldier. That is the first recorded case we have. There'd been a great battle, and when people could finally get into the battle scene, Er's body was the only one that had not decayed. So they had him on the funeral pyre, and as the flames were licking up, he revived and got off the funeral pyre by himself, glowing, and began to talk about his experience on the other side of death, those 2 weeks. Where he was, what he saw, what he heard, what he was told.
When Raymond Moody wrote his book, Life After Life, in 1975, he coined the phrase near-death experience. Prior to that, we did not know what these experiences were. We didn't know how prevalent they were. People who had them had never heard of anyone else having had these experiences.
My first exposure to the phenomena of the near-death experience was in Vietnam in 1969. I was a brand new nurse, went to Vietnam, would have patients tell me about these experiences they had. I didn't know at the time what they were. Of course, we didn't have a real name for them. But I knew they were important and that they had been significant for these patients. They would come in, we'd see them, we'd patch them up, we'd send them out. So I didn't have the opportunity usually to talk to them for very long. But what some of them would say are things like, I remember the explosion. I remember the next thing I was doing was looking at the ground. But I wasn't in my body, I was outside of my body. And in one occasion I remember a young man saying, and I could see other spirits around of my buddies who had died during this same explosion. They would tell me things like that they were sent back, they didn't want to live, they wanted to go wherever they thought they were going, but that they were sent back and told that they had more to live, they had more to do. I basically just listened then and would put that someplace in my mind that I put it all together later on.
There's one particular case that's been documented and has been in the literature for near-death experiences for a while. And this was a young woman who had a saccular aneurysm, or swelling of a blood vessel at the base of the brain, that was inoperable, meaning that they could not operate on her and fix it without causing her death. There was an experimental procedure, however, where they would chill her body down by hooking her up to a heart-lung bypass machine with her core temperature to the point where she had a cardiac arrest and all her brain activity would cease. During this period of time, she watched what was going on in the operating room, describing the use of a bone saw that had been used in opening her skull to access her aneurysm. She also recalled events about how the artery in her leg was too small when they were trying to hook into it with the heart-lung machine. This was done when she was not only unconscious, but also clinically dead by all measures.
A near-death experience is not wishful thinking. It's not a dream. It's not oxygen deprivation. It is an intense impact of energy that carries with it many times imagery and sound and feeling. But what I'm seeing is that intensity, that punch, that bolt. Where is it coming from? What is it? I want to know that. And I want to know why and how it affects people to the extent it does.
The characteristic that really, I think, hits home for me or resonates with me is children and when they see departed loved ones. They talk about people who have already died. They've never been around their city block, but they will tell you that I met Uncle Jones. He was my fourth uncle on this side. He lived in Birmingham. He died in a fire, and he's buried at yada yada place. I mean, they can come back sometimes with very specific data. You typically don't have that kind of information in a dream.
We now have a phenomenon that says quite loudly, life isn't what we think it is. Death isn't what we think it is. The paranormal is normal. That there can indeed be all kinds of activity that stretches the imagination beyond what we used to think was credible.
I was at the edge of the water and I was putting pebbles in a bucket and I was really having a good time. And so when I started to walk forward, I lost my bucket, and when I went to retrieve it, my foot went into a hole and it sucked me under like a ledge. So I was breathing all this water into my lungs, and all of a sudden I popped out of my body and I looked and I was going up and I could see blonde hair floating on top of water. And I wasn't afraid. I felt like I was home. Then I saw my grandmother. I didn't know what grandmother that was. I knew it was Grandma. She told me, "Linda, if you go back, you'll learn many things." And then the scene opened up and I could look down. I looked at my mom and I felt how scared and panicky she was. And I looked at my dad and I could see them carrying my limp body out of the water and they were working on it. And then all of a sudden my gaze went to my brother Bobby. And I said, "Oh, I have to go back. I have to go back for Bobby." And instantaneously I was in my body.
So the out-of-body experience is a common component, finding yourself in that incredible light, meeting loved ones who've died and gone on before, or spirit beings, or light beings of some kind. It's also fairly common to reach that realm, which we call in research the realm of all-knowing, or that sense that all of the puzzle pieces in life are being filled in.
I was 7 years old. I was in vacation, it was July. I was running in a field full of flowers. And when I was just about to reach for the flowers, I felt an horrible pain on my left ankle. And I stood back for a second and I saw this snake. I lost consciousness. Everything was dark then, and I was in my grandmother's bed. 2 doctors were around me and thinking that, I would never make it. I went into a coma for 10 days. I saw my body, I left it, and this beautiful being of light came to my encounter. I was not in my body, I was floating. We came together, we reached one from the other. This was the most beautiful thing I ever seen. Not just the being of light, but what she brought along with her was this enormous love. She said, "You are going to be fine, you're not going to die, don't be afraid." And then she went on and told me many, many different things, but she said mainly that I would be here to help people. This was my destiny.
When we're talking about the pleasant or heavenly experience, 15 to 18% of the people have this. These are the people who come back, usually the most infused, to make a difference in society.
I flatlined. I died in the dentist chair 9 years ago. When I died, I was in the dentist chair, then all of a sudden I found myself in this dark tunnel. And I realized, where am I? And looked down at myself, and I was just a body of light. I got pulled along with the rest of these souls, if you will, and then I found myself going through layers of white light that were curved like the softness of a cup. But each of these layers that went up and I was passing through was a different light. And all of a sudden, from out of the light comes this magnificent voice that said, "You're safe. You're here with me. You do not have to return. You're safe with me."
We can't use the old arguments anymore. We can no longer say it's a hallucination. We can no longer say it's oxygen deprivation. We as a society are challenged to rethink what we call paranormal.
The Gallup poll that came out in the 80s said that there were 8 million experiencers in the United States, I believe, and that was a conservative estimate.
Of course, it's now more prevalent than it probably has been in the past because of medical advances.
When you are having an open heart surgery, for example, chances are that you may have a near-death experience, much more than you would 20 years ago.
Back in the 1960s, we invented emergency interventions which were capable of bringing people back from the brink of death. So we're resuscitating far more people who've been critically ill than we ever have in the history of the planet.
But out of all these people who go through it, not everyone reports it, no.
I just thought that everybody that had this experience was normal and it was okay. I told my husband, and he said, "Oh, it was just brain cells dying." So this most profound thing that has happened to me in my whole life, I didn't have anybody that was close to me that I could share that with.
And I never talk about it to anybody except my grandmother. And the first thing she said to me, she said, "Don't ever talk about this. They would put you away. Nobody is going to understand what happened to you."
You're talking about a lot of patients every day who have near-death experiences and will go home without ever having a support system and may go on for years without ever talking about it. And that's, of course, our key, to try to get people where they have people they can talk to and people that are knowledgeable enough to support them and not hurt them.
IANDS is the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Their purpose is to help understand what it is, to help experiencers incorporate it into their life.
I remember 25 years ago when there were 20 of us in somebody's living room. We were sitting trying to write out clinical guidelines. How would we help people? And we've come a long way, and we aren't there yet. We haven't got the exposure. We have a fairly common phenomena, but not one that we've got the resources and what we need to help fix and provide a stable support system for experiencers.
When you come out of a near-death experience, there are after effects, which put usually the person in turmoil, very deep questioning, why?
You know, you can deny the experience, you can't deny the after effects. We're talking about changes in the digestive system, changes in brain structure, brain chemistry, brain function because of these experiences. Most of them report significant changes in their body as well as their attitudes in their mind after this experience.
It's a certain percentage of people with near-death experiences will go on to have increased psychic and healing ability.
They're able to access sounds and thoughts of other people. They have a range of awareness of their environment that just seems to have jumped out of all proportion. The energy of their body is suddenly popping light bulbs or turning them off when they walk by.
I know of one person who it was so frightening to her, she just shut down because she could tell when things were going to happen to people, and it was frightening to her. As she grew older and had a support system around her, she learned how she could use those in a positive way and help people.
Many of the people who had a near-death experience have turned to hospice work for obvious reason. We've become friends with this. We've been there. We understand it. We're not afraid of it.
Once you've had this, you're not afraid of dying because you know you never die. And if you know you never die, you live your life differently.
A near-death experience is a household word. I think most people know what it is. You see jokes about it and seeing the light. And if you're really going to take care of people, you're going to find out about this phenomenon and try to get more information and support them.
The more near-death experiencers that come out and talk about it, then it demystifies it and it makes it not as scary.
If we accept a near-death experience as something that does in fact occur, especially with all the events associated with it, we may have to change our understanding and develop new theories about the relationship between consciousness, the mind, and the brain.
What if we're kidding ourselves by thinking that we're in control of our lives? What if there's another power? What if the secret of life is becoming who you really are? How differently would you live?